Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. So nice to be here. Yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me. I've only been to DLD once, and I have to say, coming back now, I'm kind of cross with myself for not having been in the interim. What energy. And I feel like a guy who's got the band back together. You know, this is great. The Erik Andy band. I think not just 2, 3 best-selling books about, you know, the machine age.
If you take a very liberal definition of bestseller, then yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Among my mom, it sold huge.
A number of great books that look at the impact of this revolution we're in the midst of on labor markets, on society. We are going to talk about the subject we're supposed to talk about, which is the tech gap between Europe and America. But I really did want to start, perhaps having heard fascinating discussions this morning about the impact of this current phase of generative AI. I wanted to know first from you guys, has the second machine age turned out as you expected? Erik.
Yes and no. So we got lucky when we wrote The Second Machine Age that it was just at the early stages of the deep learning revolution that it's still playing out. And it's one of the biggest things that's happened, not just in AI, but I think on the planet. And now we're at the beginning to have another wave of AI that I think is equally big to deep learning, generative AI or foundation models. We have a team at Stanford that looks at them. And it's accelerating many of the changes, but it's also, ironically, reversing many of them. So we had this nice pat understanding of the kinds of tasks that could be done well by machine learning. I wrote a suitability for machine learning rubric, and we looked at which jobs would be most affected. And a lot of that is flipped upside down. We thought that writers, journalists, professors, CEOs would be among the last to be affected. And now with these foundation models, many of them are being affected quite significantly. Obviously, there's some remarkable writing being done and art, but also I had a friend, Todd Lifborough, who had to do his meetings as CEO, and he needed to come up with a set of KPIs for his meeting. And he was having a little trouble. He put it into ChatGPT, and he's like, oh my God, that is what I was looking for. So I wouldn't have thought that CEOs would be early on the list, but it's changing a little bit what we expected.
I was going to do that actually this morning. I was going to ask Chat what I should ask you guys, and I'm afraid I had too many other things to do and didn't. So this is human intelligence rather than Chat would have done it much better. What will be the labor market impact? Because one of the really interesting insights you had was to lay out very clearly how this was going to affect labor markets, the first wave. Do you think this is being flipped too, and what do you think are the consequences, Andy?
So let me try to answer that by answering your first question first. When I think back about the second machine age, I think we underestimated the technology acceleration that was going to happen. And we didn't write it to be deliberately conservative, but I didn't see these LLMs, these foundation models coming. I think I at least overestimated the labor market impact. And I think personally, if I could go back and teleport myself, I would do a little bit less of that contributing to the conversation about, oh my heavens, jobs are at risk. The unemployment rate in the United States is at a 50-year low right now. We are not facing a job apocalypse. Our colleague Bob Gordon says it really well. We don't have a job quantity problem. We have had a job quality problem. Technology is a contributor to that. And I think we're in danger when every really super powerful new technology comes along, we are in danger of doing something that I learned from The Economist. We tend to overestimate the impact in the short term and underestimate it in the long term. And I think right now we're overestimating in the short term.
Does that mean actually, and there was some discussion about this morning, that this technology can be much more job augmenting or labor augmenting, changing, helping being creative, helping people do things much more, changing the nature, that we should really focus more on that than the displacement risk?
I think the key word there is can, and I think we have a choice about how it's used. And one of my frustrations is so many people are being Luddites about this technology, fearful that it's going to, put writers, artists out of business. I think we should be embracing it, and it's a replay of what we've seen with almost every technology wave. Absolutely, technology's been destroying jobs, absolutely, technology's been creating jobs, but if we use it the right way, we can have a decade or more of the most amazing art, the most amazing writing, poetry, songs, more incisive essays as well, nonfiction, but I think it always requires keeping a human in the loop. These technologies, as we've heard for the past couple of days, they have a lot of deep flaws. They can hallucinate and make things up. But done right, that becomes a creativity tool.
Absolutely. A little example, we did a big cover story on what we call them foundational AI models or generative models. The cover was designed by an AI. We just put in the prompt. It was mind-blowing, the things it came up with, and I now regularly ask to see what the AI will come up with if we're doing cover, if I'm thinking of cover prompts, because it's fantastically useful.
Think about that example. Let me double down on something Erik said. I think the way that in conversations and in conferences like this, the way that you demonstrate that you're a thoughtful, very smart, elite person is to be negative about new technologies and to think of all the things that could possibly go wrong. And there is a role for that. However, there's also a role to say, holy Toledo, this is going to be fantastic in a lot of ways. And if we are putting very powerful creative tools in the hands of more people, I'm kind of optimistic about that. I don't want to join this predominantly negative elite conversation about technology. I think we've got the balance way off.
I completely agree.
Oh, wow.
I think certainly in my industry, it's going to be transformative, and I think largely for the better. It's going to be such an amazing tool for journalists to be able to use, and for creative people broadly. But there is, I think, being upbeat about it doesn't mean you should be, not cognizant of risks. And so, keeping the conversation optimistic, and we're then we need a lot of optimism to start talking about Europe. So let's keep it really optimistic.
You said that.
But what are the risks or the challenges from this latest generative phase do you think are ones that one should be concerned about? Not that you shouldn't do it, but that one should be concerned about, Erik.
Well, so one of the things I liked about our 2014 book was we ended it not with blind optimism or blind pessimism, but this idea that we have a lot of choices. And the more powerful the tools are, the more choices we have. And these tools can be used, and I think should be used if we use them right for the great things that Andy was just describing. But there's also a scenario where they're used in a lot of negative ways. One of the ones that we've heard about are deepfakes, misinformation generation. From an economist's perspective, if the cost of generating information goes to zero, the quantity can go to a very large number. We could be flooded with a bunch of information. It's hard to tell what it's saying, who it's from, and no human can keep up with it. So we need to come up with some countermeasures for that. It also can be used, in some cases, to replace work, and if technologists and managers aren't very creative about it, they'll simply do the same things they were doing before, but shift it from labor to capital. And that can lead to a more concentration of wealth, more concentration of political power. I don't think that's the most likely outcome. I don't think that's what has to happen, but it's something that we need to be cognizant of.
So that's actually a pretty good segue to the subject, with apologies, that we should have been talking about for most of this session, which is the US-EU tech gap. Because one question that comes from this is, if you are a little behind, is that gap going to grow even further? And so I wanted to start with you, which is, can you give me a sense of how you think Europe is on the frontier relative to, say, when you first started thinking about this, a decade, 15 years ago?
Zanny, you know the definition of a great question on stage like this is one that you have a slide for.
And I actually actually not prepared. You don't have a slide.
I have 2 slides for this one. So could we see the first one?
Oh, there they are. Okay.
No, but right now only we can see them. And we're keeping everybody in suspense.
They've got a lot of circles on. I can describe it.
Right, Zanny's going to describe the slide to us. So here it is.
There we go.
All right. So this is a visualization that I put together. Erik, scoot out of the way, please. He's too tall for this. This is a visualization of the 100 most valuable public companies in the world at the end of the year 2000. They're divided into 4 geographic bunches. We've got Europe right here. This is all of America except for the West Coast. This is the West Coast of America, and this is the rest of the world, predominantly East Asia. So you see how the bubbles are divided up. The size of the bubble is proportional to the market cap of the company, so that's the value of the company. And the greener it is, the newer it is. Does that make sense? Do we kind of get it? Now, what I don't want to do is do a year-by-year animation, because that gets boring kind of quickly. I'm going to fast forward to where we were at the end of 2022. So mentally, you got your bubble sizes and comparative sizes of the bunches. Here's the end of 2022. So there has been a big shift. And keep in mind that all those bubbles you see on the west coast of the US, this is not the start of 2022. This is the end of 2022, after the evaporation of trillions of dollars of market cap.
So they were even bigger in 2021.
The 2021 version of this is a little bit silly. It's so lopsided. Here's the end of 2022. And we see that the growth has come at the ends here in Asia primarily, but the compound growth rate on the west coast of the United States is more than 6%. This is all in real terms. Europe, my friends, Europe has shrunk in real terms over that time. And so for the past couple years, I've been here at DLD trying to say to my European friends and colleagues, gang, the gap is wide and it appears to be getting wider instead of closing over time. And I try to say this as a member of Team Liberal Democratic West. I want us to win the race for technological supremacy. And I say as gently as I can, the gap is getting bigger. Now, I'll let Erik back in.
Okay, so well, let's abstract from, so this is public companies, but it does, we can quibble about whether public companies is the right metric and so forth, but it's telling a clear story. Erik, let's assume, let's posit, the story is a widening gap between Europe and the frontier. First of all, why is that? This is a big market.
Yeah. Well, so this is great illustration, and it really gets to the dynamics of the difference between a digital information economy and a traditional economy that's really based on atoms. And the scalability you can have in digital network economies, and we wrote a little bit about this in the second machine age, it's just fundamentally different. You can replicate things almost limitlessly. That tends to lead to not just winner-take-all outcomes, but power law outcomes, where there's a small group of people that win a lot. And there's something in economists called a preferential attachment model, that basically the rich get richer, the big get bigger. Taylor Swift is going to get a lot more followers just because people run into her on Twitter. And likewise, companies that already have a competitive advantage, they have a network, they tend to have advantages to growing. Now, it's not inevitable. Joseph Schumpeter described, creative destruction, and you can have these winners collapse. But it is a different dynamic than what we saw in the 20th century and earlier centuries.
Let me do a yes and on this, because I think Erik nailed one phenomenon, and there's another phenomenon going on as well, which is the subject of the book that I'm finishing up right now, which is, let's say I agree with all that, I think it's underestimating the phenomenon. And the phenomenon is that a lot of the principles that you use for managing a company that is subject to those winner-take-all power law dynamics, those apply to industries where those winner-take-all effects are not nearly as strong. You see one of the greenest bubbles there is Tesla. Tesla is not a primarily, well, they're a pretty digital company. They make a lot of atoms and ship them all over the world. You don't think of automotive as necessarily a winner-take-all industry subject to network effects and positive externalities, and yet Tesla is by far, still, after this decline of more than 50% in its market cap, it's by far the most valuable auto company in the world, and it does a pretty good job of making cars. The Tesla Model Y is right now, I believe, the most popular car in Europe. So I agree, but the principles you use for running digital companies apply surprisingly well to the world of atoms.
And let me loop that back to the first conversation I had with Andy. So let me tell you,
This is how you guys write books.
No, I know exactly it is.
This is the polite version of how we write books.
So the way Andy and I met is I was visiting Harvard Business School, and Andy was a professor there, and he came and knocked on my door and started describing something that was happening at CVS. And
pharmacy chain in the US.
And one of my favorite pieces of work that I wrote with Andy is one that we never got around to publishing. It's called Scale Without Mass. Yep. And basically, it laid out this phenomena that Andy's describing, which is that I think it's not hard for people to understand the economics of digital networked and how there's a winner-take-all dynamic. But I think what's even more interesting is the other 95% of the economy is increasingly becoming like that. Whether it's Tesla or CVS or many other companies, the internals of them are digitizing. And so they're beginning to have some of the same economics, some of the same fundamentals that those digital companies.
Managerial imperatives.
Exactly. Yeah. And as a result, we need to learn from those companies. We'll let you talk now, Ken.
No, you're the guys who are supposed to be talking, but I agree with most of what you say, but the kind of European in me is now coming out, and I'm going to kind of push back at this, because we see here, and we see increasingly an incredibly innovative, exciting sort of ecosystem of startups. Money is now coming, VC money is coming from the US. And so the question is all of this inevitable? And if I take your trajectory, you might say, well, the giants are already here, with the economics of this is winner takes all. But look at a TikTok, which has come and massively disruptive.
Absolutely.
There is an ability to disrupt here. We're seeing the technology we've talked about this morning, which gives lots more chance for disrupting. So I don't really buy the idea that it's inevitable that this continues. So then the question is, what needs to happen in Europe? What does there need to be more of to ensure that we have more dark green circles here?
Yeah. And I think that's exactly the right question, because I violently agree with you. The point that Erik and I are not making is that those are permanent big green circles. Absolutely not. Disruption happens over and over again.
It's not over here have sort of, shot themselves in the foot. No, that's China, basically, rest of the world.
Yeah,
And they've shot themselves in the foot.
So where are the big green circles of 10 or 20 years from now going to come from? And what would make Europe more likely to have them? Wow, that's the big question.
That's the question I'd like you to answer.
And I see we're just about out of time.
No, you have plenty of time to answer that.
There are a bunch of things. And I think the shortest answer is nobody really knows. It's a bit of a mystery to me why that cluster is as small as it is. But in general, there are two very different philosophies about how you manage a society, manage an economy during a time of pretty profound technological change and disruption. And I'm going to oversimplify a little bit. One of them says when there's a period this profound, this disruptive, you need a lot of upstream governance. The other says, no, you don't. When there's a period of change this profound and this disruptive, you need to get the hell out of the way and let the innovators and the entrepreneurs do what they do. It's called permissionless innovation at that school, and deal with the problems that come up as opposed to trying to head them all off in advance with wise governing bodies.
So is this a polite way of saying that the European regulatory approach is misguided?
I'd say it. I don't think that's way too polite. Yeah, I hope it's clear from what I just said. I am firmly on team permissionless innovation. I think that is not the dominant philosophy that I see coming out of the EU right now.
So there is a logic that I think some in the EU, certainly in the Commission, have, which is that Europe's comparative advantage will be in the quality of its regulation. It will be a kind of regulatory superpower. Yeah, one bursts out laughing and one's eyebrows raised.
So I'm not as pessimistic as Andy is about some of the regulation. I think there are places where Europe has done some good regulation, but I think there's a much bigger picture, and it actually gets back to Andy's new book, which is that when you have these...
As every conversation should,
exactly,
let's be honest.
So when you have these technological fundamentals that we talked about for digital goods, that's really just the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole complementary system of reinforcing institutions, regulations, culture, skills that has to go with it. And a lot of those are invisible and difficult to identify unless you do a lot of careful research, and even then it's hard. And Europe has unfortunately been locked into a set of complementary processes and practices that are not conducive as they could be to creating those big green bubbles over there. And let me illustrate. So last night,
a couple examples.
I had a good conversation with a venture capitalist in Europe, and you guys know this, but I didn't know this until last night. The word for venture capital in German is Risikokapital, or Risikokapital. Did I say that right? Someone can say that for me. So she said that translates as risk capital, not venture capital. And to me, I would much rather create a venture than create a risk. and I think that is indicative, she thought, of a different mentality that led to conservatism. But you can go through the same thing in terms of some of the ecosystem that's here that isn't supporting creation and sometimes failure. Most new ventures fail in a way that leads to the big wins and also some of the big losses.
I wonder if that isn't a slightly yesterday's view of Europe. Just in the following sense, and I'm saying this partly to provoke you.
Yeah, it was yesterday, actually. In fact, yesterday she told me.
On the factors you've described, the US has in many ways not been going forwards. It's been going backwards. The attitude to immigration has shifted. The political attitudes towards tech have shifted. And in Europe, you are actually seeing attempts to make it a more conducive place for venture capital. You're seeing regulatory changes at the national level certainly designed to attract. maybe that's not enough, but I wonder whether things aren't shifting somewhat, and that actually the fact that all of the big VC firms from the US are coming here to try and look for investments is surely a sign of that.
I hope so. I mean, I would love to see it. Europe has so many natural advantages. I mean, it's got one of the most skilled workforces, it's got incredible scientific
great universities.
It's got a giant market, 400 million people, so it has a lot of natural advantages as well. So if there are some of those changes happening, I could see it catching up, but it's going to have to overcome those disadvantages I just laid out.
And to reinforce that and to agree with you, it feels to me in some ways like the US is trying hard to give away its advantage, right? By becoming unwelcoming to immigrants. That policy is designed by our enemies. So the opportunity is actually fairly big for the bunches to be different relative sizes going forward. But when I look at things like GDPR, when I look at things like the draft legislation around AI governance, when I look at things like forcing platforms to have backdoors to help prevent the abuse of children, which is a goal I wholeheartedly agree with, but mandating that you can't have end-to-end encryption I don't believe is the right way to go about that. I don't see Europe pouncing on the opportunity that's in front of it.
And do you think the disruptive AI, the generative AI that we've talked about this morning, requires a different approach, or is likely to lead to something different? Is it less likely to be winner takes all, more likely to be winner takes all?
Well, it's more likely to be disruptive, like you just said. So there's an opportunity right now. There's a window, and I think a lot of the incumbents, we've heard Google, a lot of others, are at risk. And we'll see how they play it. They have some of the best. They have the largest concentration of AI researchers. But we're going to reshuffle the deck, and there's going to be, just as there was in the 1990s and other of these disruptions, there's going to be a new set of winners, ones that come out of nowhere. So this is a great time to make the move for for companies around the world. It doesn't mean that they're going to succeed, but the door has been opened.
That's exactly what I was trying to get at, because if this is a moment where there is another technological inflection point, the US is shooting itself in the foot to some degree. We haven't even talked about China, but that is
everyone's shooting themselves in the foot is the problem. I mean, China is doing even worse. I mean, I look at the problems in the United States, and then I look at some of the other countries, and I'm like, wow. If I had to be dealt a set of cards, I'm not sure I'd want any of the other ones.
But what's interesting is I would have thought that every new incremental AI advance would reinforce the big green bubbles that we see right there. But I actually think Erik's right. I think these advances are coming so fast, so furious, and they're profoundly disruptive to things perhaps like Google's business model. Wow, I could see a lot of flux in this kind of graph going forward.
So that's why it's up to everybody in this room to make sure that there are more dark green circles next time you come here.
But at the risk of repeating myself, when there's this kind of flux going on, I think relying more heavily on upstream governance is exactly the wrong approach.
So when are you going to Brussels to give that message?
What? Weird I haven't been invited.
We have 54 seconds left, in which I wanted to end with asking both of you, the band has written 3 books. Is there a 4th? What's it going to be on, and what's it going to be called? Because you guys have a near monopoly on fantastic titles.
We've got to let Andy finish this one, but I think we should sit down. Andy's at a much faster clock speed. He can write a lot faster and better than I can. And so he's been churning out books while I've been kind of sitting in the laboratory. But I'm beginning to build up the potential energy. We're ready to do that again. So
it's time to get the band back together. I think all good bands have solo projects, but I think it's time to reunite Wham. And then the question is, which of us is George Michael? Is the only really interesting question there.
Well, it's going to be. We know that GPT-4 is going to be a co-author as well.
There you go. Erik, Andy, GPT-4, Wham for our era. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.